Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's event. This is on tools and resources for pursuing climate change federal funding and addressing environmental justice. We are going to get started here in just a minute. We're waiting for people to join us. In the meantime, I'm going to start sharing slides and getting ready for today's discussion. I'm going to ask the panelists to please turn off your video and your sound. This session is being recorded. So to begin, I would like to introduce my co-host, Naoki Nagai, who is going to be serving as DJ today. And I will be your MC, Veronica Rocha. We are both advisors to PICHTR. Welcome to today's webinar. To get us started, I'm going to ask if you can all please put in the chat a quick introduction. If you can please let us know where you're calling from and how did you hear about this webinar. Naoki, may I please ask if you can let us know who has, where are people calling from? Has anybody?
No, not yet. Please, feel free to introduce yourself, everybody. So there's the question and answer box and the chat box. Maybe you can first try the chat box to send it to everybody. Where you're calling from, just your name or affiliation. Oh, the chat is disabled these days.
Oh, interesting. Well, I'm very sorry to hear that the chat has been disabled. Not sure how that happened. And to be honest, not sure that we can fix it at this point.
Yeah, the question and answer is working, which is good.
Yeah, the Q&A is working. So let's just focus on Q&A for today. So let's put in the Q&A your name. Actually, if you can please put in your name, unless it's, you know what, your name is already appearing. So that would be great. Your name, where you're calling from, how did you hear about your webinar? And go ahead and let us know if you have any questions that you're hoping will be answered by today's discussion. And then Naoki, if you can please read out some of the responses that we're getting. We currently have 56 participants and we're hoping more folks will be able to join us. So Naoki, can I turn it over to you?
Oh, yeah. So thank you very much for using the question and answer box. I have Kat from Jill Eva Lands, who is working on conservation efforts, and Julie Hong, Honolulu. She heard the webinar about the webinar from Veronica Malachi, I think, from Eva Beach, from North Miami. Heard about the webinar from City Planner. Thank you for joining us. Stuart from Vi, he heard about the webinar from us, PICHTR. Someone from Charleston, NOAA Office for Coastal Management, and from Chicago, Kauai, a lot of places, Veronica. Yeah, thank you everybody for joining.
Thanks, Naoki, and thanks everyone for being here today. I see that more and more people are joining, so it's really exciting. I know this is a topic that has received quite a bit of attention. So before we get started, I would like to thank our sponsors. Our latest sponsors is Island Insurance Foundation. Thank you so much for your kind support. Also, we have received support from the Athletes and Family Foundation, Hawaiian Electric companies, as well as the Consulate General of Japan in Honolulu. So thank you all for your kind support. Really appreciate it. Today's discussion, I will provide a quick backdrop and then go into introductions. We have excellent panel presentations today, then we're going to go into the group discussion. I do want to encourage everybody to please proactively submit your questions into the Q&A. For some reason, the chat has been disabled. Don't worry, let's just use the Q&A. Enter your questions at any time. We have a lot of time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. Really quickly, PICHTR's history and vision. So PICHTR is a 501c3 nonprofit that was established in 1985 with a mission to expand opportunities, economic opportunities in Hawaii by promoting public-private partnerships and advancing sustainable development. Today's program is is being brought to you by PICHTR's Climate Grants Accelerator, which I'm going to be talking about in a minute. But first, a quick discussion backdrop. As many of you all know, for the first time, we are seeing historic federal investments in climate change stemming from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and most recently, the Inflation Reduction Act, plus several other funding sources that are coming down the pike. Coupled with this is the Justice 40 initiative, which is ensuring that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments flow to disadvantaged communities. So for today's discussion, we are going to be talking about tools and resources to help you successfully pursue climate change related federal funding opportunities, as well as addressing environmental justice, which is key to over 140 federal funding programs. I'm going to be talking about PICHTR's Climate Grants Accelerator. Then our panelists are going to be delving into Hawaii's Hawaii Grants to Projects Bridge, Hawaii's social vulnerability framework, Oahu's social vulnerability index. Unfortunately, we're not going to be talking about that today, but we are going to be talking about data-driven approaches to environmental justice. So with that, I'm going to ask Naoki if you can please show us the presentation for PICHTR's Climate Grants Accelerator. A quick history on PICHTR. Since 1996 to 2022, PICHTR has managed federal funding programs totaling over $248 million from various agencies stemming from Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and several other entities. Next slide. We have certainly seen a changing federal funding paradigm. This has been Hawaii's experience, where in the earmark era, approximately 1996 through 2010, it saw quite a bit of investment coming into Hawaii from earmarks. And then there was an earmark moratorium that spanned from 2011 to 2019, where you can see that substantially less funding came to Hawaii. Now, we're looking at the COVID era and beyond, starting in 2020, quite a bit of federal funding really started to flow into Hawaii. And I can imagine that the experience was also very similar to other, states and territories from the U.S. The money has stemmed from, CARES Act all the way to the American Rescue Plan and other funding sources. Next slide, please. For this reason, PICHTR decided to, package its experience in administering federal funding and deploying related programs under its Climate Grants Accelerator, which is a one-stop shop support service for NGOs, government entities, and businesses wanting to pursue federal funding, but not having the resources to do so. Numerous agencies are providing federal grants related to address climate change as well as environmental justice. And so what PICHTR has done is that under the Climate Grants Accelerator is put forth a service that provides listing of climate change related funding opportunities, stakeholder coordination across disciplines and sectors, matching with collaborators and community partners, federal funding application support, as well as submission and drafting, implementation of programs, federal funding related programs, and administration of those, including accounting, reporting, and auditing. What I think differentiates PICHTR is that it is able to provide rapid and efficient hiring of federal funded projects. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a typical federal grant process. It begins with a concept paper, and then it moves to a full application and administration once the award is made. And what we wanted to communicate here is that PICHTR is really able to support you really from the beginning of helping you put together a concept paper, submit the application, as well as supporting you with the administration of federal funding as well. Next slide. So some of the unexpected issues that come up related to federal grants and why some entities do not pursue them is one, a cash flow issue. With federal funding, they tend to be on a reimbursement basis. And some entities, some in particular, like smaller NGOs, don't have the cash flow to be able to support this. This is an area where PICHTR is able to like jump in and serve as the principal investigator and the administrator, able to put forth that initial capital and then be able to pursue the reimbursement. Insurance requirements, oftentimes there are significant insurance requirements that are required. Again, sometimes smaller organizations have a difficult time being able to do this, but because PICHTR has been implementing and administering programs from federal funding, it has already the insurance requirements in place. And also reporting and auditing is something that we hear from entities where they struggle to have the manpower to be able to both execute on the programs as well as doing the reporting and the administration. Again, an area that PICHTR can jump in and support you in. Next slide, Naoki. I know that I'm going really fast through this content, and the reason why is I really want to give the majority of the time to our excellent panelists to provide their presentations. But I do want to conclude this discussion of PICHTR's Climate Grants Accelerator by saying that if you are interested in learning more, please go to www.pichtr.org/climate-grants-accelerator, where you can find more information. You can, click on the link to take a look at all of the climate-related funding opportunities. There's over 30 billion nationwide in climate-related funding opportunities that are applicable to entities here in Hawaii across the profit, nonprofit, and public sectors. You can also sign up for our newsletters where you can find out about new funding opportunities, news, and resources. You can also submit a questionnaire to us at the Climate Grants Accelerator if you already have a project where we may be able to support you. And of course, if you just want to learn more and you have a question, feel free to email us or to call us. So with that, I will now like to introduce our panelists. And let me share screen one more time. Our first presenter is Leah Laramie, and Leah is the Hawaii Climate Change Commission coordinator. Let me get her slide. Let me get her bio here. Leah has a background in a natural resource management. She was previously the lead on climate mitigation and adaptation for the Division of Forestry and Wildlife and the state lead for the U.S. Climate Alliance Natural and Working Lands team. Leah has led many international collaboration efforts, including hosting the 2016 IUCN World Conservation Congress and the Global Green Island Summit. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Soo-Won Shen. She is an associate professor at the Urban and Regional Planning Department, College of Social Sciences at University of Hawaii, Manoa. And Soo-Won holds an MA and a PhD in urban planning and an MS in civil engineering from the University of Florida. For the past decade, her research focuses on the interaction between critical infrastructure systems and the changing environment with an emphasis on climate change, vulnerability, and adaptation. Using transportation and land use models, spatial analysis, and environmental projections and simulations, she investigates the vulnerability of critical infrastructure and adaptation options to climate change and explores the factors influencing local vulnerability and adaptive capacity. Next, I would like to introduce you to Dorney Bergdorf. She is a senior environmental and social specialist at Jacobs. Dorney is skilled at providing environmental and social risk assessments for public agencies and lenders as well as private clients. She has helped clients to successfully measure environmental and social risks, impacts, and navigate the challenges of environmental and social clearance for projects of regional, national, and international significance for over 20 years. She has worked extensively in developing world and specialized social impact assessments with a focus on equity, land acquisition, resettlement, gender, and livelihood restoration impacts. As you can see, we have an amazing lineup of panelists. So without further delay, I would like to turn it over to Leah to please present on the initiative that she is working on, the Hawaii Climate Commission.
Aloha, everybody. Thanks, Veronica, for that introduction, and mahalo for all of you for joining us today. I'm going to be talking today about our the Climate Commission's Grants Project Bridge project. I first of all just want to give you folks a little bit of an overview on what the commission does. So the State of Hawaii Climate Change and Mitigation and Adaptation Commission is really tasked with looking at both mitigating and adapting to climate change. That's looking at a whole swath of different options, looking at high density housing to carbon sequestration. We're concerned with sea level rise, electrification of homes, as well as maintaining our natural areas. So as you folks, I'm sure, are all familiar. Oh, I don't know what's going on there. We're already experiencing a bunch of different impacts from climate change. We have rising sea levels, which are not only impacting our homes, but also some of our critical infrastructure and some of our natural areas and historical areas as well. Rising temperatures are leading to, exacerbating heat impacts and human health, having impacts on our native forest birds, with the mosquitoes being able to go higher and higher into their ecosystems. This leads to droughts and wildfires, which have huge impacts on our ability to recharge our water aquifers. And that also leads into less and heavy rain. So we see in drier places, they get drier, and in wetter places, it gets wetter. So both of these have their own challenges. With less rain, we obviously have the droughts and the wildfires, less recharge to our aquifers. And then with the heavy rains, we're really experiencing flooding, as well as a lot of erosion and runoff onto our waters and reef ecosystems. So there's a lot of different challenges that we're already experiencing, and the Climate Commission is really trying to address those. The State of Hawaii has a lot of different goals. The probably primary one is that we want to be carbon net negative by 2045. And that includes being 100% powered by renewable clean energy. We also have a lot of intermittent goals, which are outlined here, which, help us on our pathway to be climate ready Hawaii. So why did we establish a climate commission? In 2016, 197 countries agreed to limit the global temperature to below 2 degrees Celsius. And Hawaii established the commission in order to meet those goals and identify vulnerable communities and industries, ecosystems, and the potential economic impacts for climate change related challenges. So who's on the commission? We have 20 members, 2 co-chairs, one at DLNR and one at the Office of Planning and Sustainable Development. The commission includes legislators, county planning directors, and directors and chairs of state departments and boards, and 1 coordinator, myself. We also are lucky enough to have our Climate Ready Hawaii cohort, which includes VISTA positions from AmeriCorps at several different offices. So we have one at DLNR, Hawaii Department of Transportation, the Hawaii County Department of Planning, County of Kauai, and the Hawaii State Energy Office. So together with this amazing group of individuals, we've created the Grants to Projects Bridge. It was created with the last cohort of Vistas, and this cohort is continuing to work on it. The purpose is really to look at underutilized grants to fund projects that haven't been able to find funding. So this supports the Commission's statement to help direct investments to priority climate smart infrastructure. Oftentimes we're looking at, maintaining and repairing existing infrastructure, but what we really want to do is to start looking at the best ways that we can take action now so that we're more resilient into the future. So the Grants Project Bridge includes transportation projects. The projects are from state and county plans. They include multimodal transportation projects and includes this information, which includes the priority of the project, where the project is located, who has the jurisdiction to implement the project, a description of the project, the cost, and, kind of the area that the project would encompass. The plans, the active transportation project plans that we've filled in these projects from are from these plans listed here on the side. So there are a variety of different plans that we've gone through and selected the climate smart projects that haven't been yet funded from there. And then it's listed here, and this is kind of an example. So we're in the early stages, it's another spreadsheet, not super fun to go through, but this is an example of what it looks like right now. So you can see this is an example from the Halemai Maui long range transportation plan. So you can see the location of the project, what the project type is, the name, the priority, and the cost. That's an example. The Grants Project Bridge also includes resilience projects. So these projects are mainly taken from state CIP requests. We've worked with the state departments to ask them if there's any unfunded CIP requests. And this includes nature-based solutions, as well as like ecosystem restoration. And the information here is location, project type, description, and cost estimate. So here's an example of the resilience and natural and working lands kind of type of projects. So you can see we have the islands that they're on, which plan or department that they're from, the category, the project name, and then the description of those projects. I'm sure you folks are all familiar with the bipartisan infrastructure law, and I didn't update this to include the Inflation Reduction Act as well. But the bipartisan infrastructure law that passed in November provides over $567 billion in new spending on infrastructure over the next 5 years. And Hawaii is expected to receive about $316 million of that to improve public transportation options across the state. So this is a really huge opportunity to implement climate smart actions and avoid locking in carbon emissions for years to come. And the great thing about these is that there's really flexible funding to enable innovative projects. So what our amazing Vistas have done is taken our Grants to Project Bridge and done a crosswalk with the available funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law. Looked at, these are the different plans, and what they've done is identified the resources that are available to fund these different types of projects. And the next step is to reach out to state and county agencies to share this information and kind of collaborate with them on ideas of expanding the information in this crosswalk to make sure that we're encompassing all of the projects that they are prioritizing. And that is it for me.
Thank you, Leah. Appreciate you sharing this wonderful information with us. If we can please turn it over now to Ms. Suwan Shen to share her screen, that would be wonderful.
Thank you, Veronica, for the introduction. Thank you, Nia, for the great presentation. Aloha all, glad to be here and then sharing a project we did with the State Climate Change Commission. So this is a work we did for the, to look at how the social vulnerability index has been applied in practice and whether the objective trying to support the equity considerations in projects in Hawaii. So we work with Dr. McKenna Kaufman and also Nia on these projects. Glad to be here and share the findings. So the objective of the research is trying to identify making equity as one of the primary considerations in all of the climate change adaptation mitigation actions, and then also trying to make that more practical to the government agencies to be able to really implement and then apply their existing data related to social vulnerability in practice. So to do that, we conducted a landscape assessment of how social vulnerability has been applied, has been used in climate-related decision makings, both across the nation as well as in Hawaii, and then try to understand how could we make that more applicable, more practical to the government agencies and the different sectors to be able to implement that in their day-to-day adaptation practice. So the series of activities we conducted trying to achieve that goal includes like reviewing the literature reviews and the existing reports, findings related to social vulnerability, what is available, trying to quantify the social vulnerability data in the literature, both in the theory as well as in practice. And then we also did a review of just nationwide, what are some of the best practice or existing status quo for applying social vulnerability in the climate adaptation initiatives or in practice. And then we realized that each region does differ, and Hawaii is quite different from other places as well. So we engaged the State Climate Commission, a Hui group, a stakeholder group, to get their feedbacks on what are the current status and what are the challenges when trying to apply these existing social vulnerability indicators locally. We reviewed the local plans and index it mentioned as well to say how can we apply it. We combine a database for public available data on climate change exposure and social vulnerability, especially the ones are important for both in general as well as the ones are important for Hawaii specifically. And then based on that, we created a Excel-based social vulnerability guide that bring together climate change shocks as well as social vulnerability indicators. So some of the major findings through the stakeholder engagement. First is also there's a lot of social vulnerability indicators and social vulnerability index available at the moment, like from the nationwide, the CDC social vulnerability index down to the local level. There are many different social vulnerability indicators. However, the existing use is very limited in climate adaptation practice, as well as even if there are applications, it is usually at a higher level and then more for as a communication tools to visualize how does for example, the social characteristics or demographic data distributed spatially. And then we also realize there's a lot of efforts in progress in the states, in Hawaii, like there are several departments and agencies. They're trying to develop and integrating social vulnerability indicators for communication and improve decision-making process. However, there are still several of the challenges identified in this research related to trying to apply these indicators in practice. So first, we get a lot of feedbacks from the Hui stakeholder group regarding that the current index indicators are usually too general. and not specific to a particular use, not customized enough to support specific applications in different sectors. And then also there will need more diverse and detailed, up-to-date, particularly data related to climate exposures by different type of exposures, as well as regarding the data qualities. There's a gap between the current spatial scale. There's a lot of different spatial scale. Most available ones maybe at the census level. However, that's not good enough to support decision making, let's say at a finer parcel level decisions in the adaptation practice. And also the more frequent data updates might make it easier to evaluate the effect of adaptations as well. There's some, in order to make it more practical, then there's some comments regarding there's a need about trying to link the specific indicators with a specific type of exposure and then link that to specific sectors adaptation actions. So many departments are currently in need of such data, but still lack the resources to process the data sets, giving the diverse data sources and data formats. So as in response to these comments and also a need to have a centralized database statewide to process the data, we develop as just a starting point initiative, we develop a climate change social vulnerability guide. So in this guide, we have identified in the literature, in theory, there's a list of unsafe conditions, like for example, related to infrastructure or housing, or related to income levels or dependence, economic dependence, or their social characteristics to make them more vulnerable, or historical disparities, or mobility constraints, or related to lack of social security or insurance. So I identified in a list of classifications of unsafe conditions, and then we map it out to how does this related to all the different type of climate shocks and stressors. So shocks is more extreme and sudden disasters, and stressors is more chronic environmental changes. So we map this out, and then we identify what are the relevant data, relevant indicators with regards to each of these climate shocks and stressors, and then with regards to each of these climate unsafe conditions. So this is one example. We identify like the type of climate related social vulnerability indicators related to sea level rise conditions, sea level rise exposures. And then the next step, we will try to help our department to create a pilot application of these social vulnerability, using these social vulnerability indicators to support their decision making, especially to try to meet for the climate justice body federal initiatives. And then we will also trying to, as a future step, trying to develop a user-friendly database and visualization tool if time permits. All right, so just want to point out to the website resources as the last step. So if you go to the, I will stop sharing for now. And then if, okay, so let me try to find this. Okay, so if you go to the State Climate Change Commission website and then goes to the equity framework, a vulnerability framework, here you can see a list of data that's social vulnerability data, and then under each of the categories and then related to the climate justice body initiatives. So this is a cross check for what are the data that might meet the climate justice body initiatives requirements, and then what are these available data sources. You can go to this, and a lot of these data are available nationally. Okay, then that will be all for me. And if there's any questions, feel free to email me or contact me.
Suwan, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. I recall that you may not be able to join us for the Q&A, or at least not all of it. So I do have a question for you. You know, you talked about the next steps and developing some use cases and working with agencies on helping them, utilize this information that you put together for decision making. So I think that's excellent. But the question that I have for you is, short of this, how can the people on this webinar leverage what you have already developed to help them in their own decision making, or to help them in pursuing federal funding?
So that's a great question. So I would say, because this is a starting point of the trying in going in this direction, right? So I would say the first thing that they can look at is that we have a good combining of all these data sets available, and then they can take a look at this, especially when talking about, we classify this by different type of climate hazards. And then especially they can looking at the type of hazards applied to their regions, and then looking at what are the indicators available, right, national-wise, and then they can use. And also like the tools on the Climate Change Commission website, the portal, that would be super helpful too, because we did a cross-check of the climate justice body interim guidance, as well as the data we can find. So you can say, you can using that as a starting point to look at, to meet the justice body requirements, these are probably the things we can start working with, looking at to build that into the decision-making process, and then to attract fundings, to qualify for fundings.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Suwan. Really appreciate all the work that you and Leah and the rest of the folks at the Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation Adaptation Commission are doing. I failed to mention earlier, and I'd like to make a note that today's webinar was co-developed by PICHTR, as well as the Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation Adaptation Commission. So really appreciate that excellent collaboration. Okay, with that, I would like to now turn it over to Dorney to present on the excellent work that you are also doing.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dorney with Jacobs, and I'm going to talk to you today about data-driven approaches to measuring and tracking environmental justice. Now, the environmental justice concept isn't new. It's been around for some time, and under the National Environmental Protection Act, we look at it in all of our environmental impact assessments as a concept. But what I'd like to suggest today is, although there are many tools out there to track environmental justice, a lot of those tools have a particular emphasis on the environmental side, as well as the demographic data side. I want to show you some tools that go a couple steps further to look at other social indicators that I think are also really important in tracking environmental justice. So, next slide. So here's a tool that we have developed at Jacobs, known as Streetlight. And so what you see here is a combined equity filter, as well as a depiction of electrical vehicle charging stations and their availability. So this is showing Massachusetts, and you can see highlighted on the map the areas that are darkly shaded are areas where there's a gap in terms of electric vehicle charging stations. And then that's overlaid with information about income in the area, so for low income areas. So there's in this particular depiction, you can see that there's a correlation along the coast. There's a lack of vehicle charging station infrastructure, as well as there tends to be a higher propensity for low income communities. So, it's interesting to look at these different filters overlaid. It really gives us an idea of where some of the gaps are in terms of energy justice. So this is one example of a tool that we can use to look at these indices overlaid. Next slide. Another indices that's really interesting to look at, overlaid with equity, is heat mapping. So, as some of the previous presentations showed, there's a lot of kind of information on the climate change side that's very relevant to look at in terms of environmental justice. So this is a depiction of heat mapping. And so I want to talk about heat mapping because heat is a really important indices in terms of climate change. It's has led to killing as many as 12,000 people a year. And during every heat wave, every 1 degree temperature increase increases the risk of dying by 2.5%. So really important indices to look at. Now, this is the city of Richmond, Virginia. Next slide. So this is also a map of the city of Richmond. And so I just want to show, you know, the close correlation between this map on the left shows what are traditionally mapped in the local city plans as the minority and high risk neighborhoods. So those areas that are outlined are the highest risk neighborhoods. And then the map on the right shows the heat mapping for those same areas. So as you can see, the hottest areas directly correlate to the low income areas. So it's just really interesting to see this depicted on a map. And then next slide. And then also looking at, you know, the sort of available infrastructure resources. This is tree lining in these areas. And so you can see that the more heavily tree lined areas fall outside of these low income and these highest heat mapped areas. So it's really important to look at indices like these to understand some of the gaps and some of the changes that need to be addressed in terms of infrastructure and some of the resources that have traditionally been allocated in these communities. So, you know, obviously this illustrates that the areas that have gotten, you know, tree lining and, you know, therefore have more shade and, you know, have been able to keep their heat levels down fall outside of these most urbanized, most inner city areas, which is, you know, obviously also a relevant indices in the communities in Hawaii. Next slide. So this is not a mapping tool specifically, but this is another tool that wasn't developed by Jacobs alone, but Jacobs contributed to this tool along with HOK and some other partners. So this is an interactive tool, and it looks at several different indices from an environmental justice perspective. So this is just an example property. It's the Fresno, California Department of Motor Vehicles, and you know, their address is entered, but it shows you some of the types of indicators that you can look at via this tool. So one of those is housing price. Another is electricity rate, natural gas rate. This tool also shows walkability score. So, you know, these indices are important because they help give you another, you know, sort of filter through which you can see that particular property. So you can measure housing prices for that particular property or that particular resource in relation to its surrounding areas. And then the same idea for electricity, natural gas, walkability, so access to different resources, cost of different resources, use of different resources. So it's just another filter through which we can look at you know, a particular resource and see you know, how it's faring in terms of access to resources and environmental justice indices. Next slide. And so a final tool that I want to suggest that's really of significance to look at in terms of environmental justice measurement is social value indicators. So this is a depiction of a project that was undertaken in the city of Vancouver. And I think, you know, what's most relevant from a social value perspective, there are a number of tools that we use in Jacobs to look at the, you know, quantification of the social value added of a project. We have acquisition within Jacobs of a company called Symmetrica that has developed very specific social value tools that help you quantify, you know, total dollars added, total training in the local community. And I think what's really relevant about this from an environmental justice perspective is overall, if we're going to be making progress in terms of environmental justice, we also need to measure the amount of money that comes back into the community to diverse and low-income businesses. So I'd like to suggest that it's also really relevant to measure the amount of community benefits. So this project in particular shows that of the money that was invested in the community, 50% was spent on contracts given to local, social, and diverse businesses. And then, we also tracked some of the community benefits that resulted from this project. So it can be anything from, investment in school programs to training programs to health projects. And so this is another way of measuring environmental justice progress that I think is very, very relevant. Next slide. So lastly, I know that you're aware about the EJ40 and Department of Energy recently launched their DOE funding for EJ40. And so I want to talk a little bit about access to funding and opportunities that are available to you under this initiative. Next slide. So in this really exciting launch, Department of Energy and their Justice 40 kickoff, these next couple of slides come from that kickoff. They're not mine, they came from the Department of Energy. But I just want to share with you some of the exciting announcements that they made in this Justice 40 kickoff. They talked about the types of funding that are available under environmental justice and energy justice. So the types of programs that are covered are climate change, clean energy and energy efficiency, clean transportation, affordable and sustainable housing, training and workforce development, remediation and reduction of legacy pollution, and critical clean water and waste infrastructure. So lots of exciting ways to plug into this funding. I'll show you a little bit more about how to do so in the next slide. So in terms of funding, there are two types of funding. There's funding that is non-competitive. So those are things like community development block grants. So those are given directly to organizations for, that qualify for their specific needs that fall under this Justice 40 heading. But what's more probably of interest to people on this call are competitive opportunities. So competitive opportunities, this is the process that will be used to select opportunities that are competitive and that you can apply for. This is a breakdown of the process. So the DOE talked about these requests for information opportunities that come out, and they really encouraged, small businesses and interested applicants to respond to these requests for information opportunities. It's the way for them to gauge interest and credentials of different organizations to pursue some of these opportunities. So they really encourage people to respond at this sort of first tier request for information. And then following that, there'll be specific funding opportunity announcements. So it could be anything from solar to clean energy to water, the potential opportunities listed on the previous slide. And I think one of the things I'd like to really encourage you to do is when you're responding to these opportunities, it's really important to include your methodology related to environmental justice in your response. Sometimes environmental justice can be a kind of an afterthought to some of the projects that we pursue. And I think it's really important that you think about how you're going to measure environmental justice as part of these initiatives, that become clear in your actual and weaved throughout your actual proposal. Really important element of advancing environmental justice and also availing of this funding. They're looking for a really strong and sound environmental justice methodology in your proposal itself. Next slide. So this last slide is just to showcase for you the available resources. You can find this on the DOE website, but this is a way to look into the specific opportunities that are going to be available under Justice 40. And so, want to be really transparent. There's a lot of great opportunities out there. It's a really exciting time to avail of climate change and environmental justice funding. And so this is, available for you all to access and to look into the specifics of the detailed opportunities that DOE is funding. So that's it for me today, and I'm happy to answer questions along with other presenters. So back over to you, Veronica.
Thank you so much, Dorney, and everybody. I'm going to encourage all of the panelists, as well as Naoki, to please turn on your cameras and your microphones. Also, we have received some questions in the Q&A. Sorry for the chat being disabled. I would like to encourage all of the participants to please submit your questions in the Q&A. We have quite a bit of time to have a very rich discussion with the panelists today and get to as many of your questions as possible. So to get us started, I have some questions that I have prepared for the panelists. And the first question is for Leah. So a question that I have for you in terms of the grants to projects bridge is, how do you see the private sector and NGOs being able to leverage this tool and to work with government entities at the state and the county?
Thanks, Veronica. Yeah, right now, a lot of the projects, all of the projects are just focused on state and county entities. So there's not, private or nonprofit projects on there. And that was purely just out of a capacity issue. We only had limited capacity to build this through. So we're definitely open to incorporating more projects so that we can have a better source of, as funding opportunities come through. But one way, and we've talked and how we could collaborate with PICHTR specifically, but how other folks can help is reaching out to the agencies where the projects are there and see if they want to support any grant writing opportunities. You can also reach out if you have similar projects and see if you want to collaborate and coalesce the two projects as one application. There's other opportunities to, just for private entities to just fund the projects if they're available, if they have funding available to them. So those are a few ways off the top of my head.
Great, thank you, Leah. Okay, the next question that I have is for Dorney. And you showed some excellent tools that JCUS has either developed or co-developed that would be helpful in evaluating environmental justice considerations. The question that I have for you is, what is the most important thing to look at in terms of environmental justice?
Well, thanks, Veronica. That's a great question. And I think all of the, potential indicators are important. So I think there's a lot to be said for even the traditional indicators, like air quality and waste cleanup and looking at the demographic makeup of a community. But I think the thing that is underdone when it comes to environmental justice is looking at the social side of environmental justice. So, that can be anything from these social vulnerability indicators to health impact assessment. I think there just needs to be a deeper dive on the social aspects of environmental justice and the vulnerability aspects of environmental justice. So that would be my answer.
Wonderful. Related question, this is for Suwan. So in the tools, social vulnerability framework that you developed, I wanted to clarify, did you specifically look at that through the lens of Justice 40, or was it broader? And you said, okay, we're going to look at Justice 40 plus more in relation to what is important for Hawaii. Can you elaborate on that?
Definitely. Yeah, that's a good question. So actually, we developed this more broadly. We look at this more from a climate resilience perspective And then we identified, just as Donnie said, right, social vulnerability indicators. But also talking about social vulnerability, maybe a lot of time people first think about it's more like social characteristics, people's demographics, and the income, these things. But then we do realize that when we're talking about social vulnerability, in theory, there's a lot of the intersections, right, creating the built environment along with the social characteristics are making people more vulnerable. So we identified just based on in theory and in practice, we classify it in these unsafe conditions, making people more vulnerable to climate hazards, specifically to different type of hazards. And then these can include both like traditional environmental injustice, like characteristics such as waste, such as air pollutions, as well as climate change just make it worse, right? Maybe the heated waves are just making these things worse. But we identify them by their type of climate hazards and then by how they are playing a role. So this is just want to show that this is what the tool looks like. So we classify this by categorize the type of climate hazards. And then under each of these, we identify what are relevant specifically to this type of hazards. And then we realize there's a lot of indicators, a lot of the data related to different things. Then we also did a cross-check related to how this is related to the climate justice body, because in climate justice body, they have identified a list of these different categories of social vulnerability characteristics, and then as a guidance, right? And then we just pick all these ones out, did a cross check and say, oh, this one will also be relevant to based on the interim guidance. They are related to climate justice body. And then I will stop sharing.
Great, thank you for that clarification. The next question is actually for everybody. And so the main topic for today's discussion is, of course, on federal funding and tools and resources, but as well as addressing environmental justice. What about other uses for this type of information? For example, in helping to cite renewable energy projects like solar and wind, or perhaps other initiatives. Can you all speak to that?
I can go first. Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, that's one of the great things of looking at for the Grants Project Bridge, for example, you know, being able to see all the different projects in one space, especially as we build capacity and are able to build out that list, we can really see, you know, are there certain areas where there are a number of projects that really haven't been invested in, kind of identify those spaces that have been underinvested in. And, you know, the amazing work that Suan and McKenna put together with, you know, the social vulnerability index, we can then cross-reference that with the Grants Project Bridge to say, okay, like, do we know there's certain areas that are maybe more vulnerable and we want to make sure that we're investing in those areas sooner than others. So there's a lot of great ways that you can use this. You know, in Dorney's presentation, there's, you know, the heat maps and as well as the tree canopy maps. We also have a state of Hawaii tree canopy viewer, which also takes into consideration a lot of these social vulnerability indices as well. And, you know, it's a great opportunity to see which areas have been underinvested in and how we can, you know, make shifts in that and make sure that we're investing in those communities.
Great, thank you. Dorney, Suan, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I want to echo, sorry, Donnie, I just go first. Yeah, I want to echo on what Nell just talks about. So for these tools and indicators, so they're related to social vulnerability, they're related to justice body, but it's way more than that. So of course it can be used in, let's say, support decision-making in climate mitigation projects, climate adaptation projects, like renewable energies or buildings, green infrastructure to deal with climate change, where to prioritize that. But also another way of looking at these tools available is that thinking about in the day-to-day operations or the even shorter term plannings, projects, capital improvement projects. How can we embed this into these existing or upcoming projects in their day-to-day operations, so that we can maybe kill two birds with one stone, or 3 birds with one stone, right? So a lot of time we're talking about climate change, we're thinking about way in the future or in decades, which is not the case. We're just seeing the impacts already, and then it's just going to be more and more severe in future. So I would say more important is, but also on the other hand, we all have things in our plate currently, which can be a lot of responsibilities and jobs to finish already. So I would say it's best if we can take a look at this, keep this in mind, and whenever we can, try to embed this with the existing jobs, responsibilities, and the current initiatives, as well as upcoming projects.
Great, thank you. Dorney.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll just add, I echo everything that the other panelists said, but also I feel like there's a great opportunity here for it to be an educational tool and a training opportunity. So I just wanted to share that one of the most successful projects that I've seen in terms of environmental justice that Jacobs was involved in was it was an air quality monitoring project, but it became a kind of a collaboration between Jacobs, the National Science Foundation, and then members of the local community. So as part of the air quality monitoring process, we were able to really get members of the community of Portland involved in the air quality monitoring itself. And so they were able to give input on, issues that were of significance to their community. So they knew specifically where, for example, there might be pockets of asthma or, other public health related issues. But then they were also able to see post the monitoring, where the hotspots were for certain types of pollutants, where greenhouse gas emissions were highest. And so then also members of the community were trained to use these air quality monitoring tools, and now they're managing the process themselves. So it's kind of an all around win, but it's also a great educational tool for the community, and then an opportunity for job training as well. So
I think that's really interesting, Dorney, right? How you're flipping the equation essentially, and it's more of a ground up initiative where you're enabling the community to have this ability, have say, have more, in some ways, control over these impacts on their community. So I think that's great. I also wanted to highlight, Dorney, what you had shared with us in terms of the community benefits package and being able to quantify that and to show that. In looking at the stage 3 renewable energy RFPs for Hawaiian Electric companies, the community benefits package is very important. It's part of that. And I think, being able to just knowing as a developer or as a community member that there are tools out there that can help one evaluate those, show them more effectively. I think that's excellent. So thank you all for your comments thus far. We have several questions in the Q&A. I want to encourage the audience to please take advantage of this time and ask your questions to our excellent panelists. So with that, let me turn it over to Naoki. Naoki, can you share with us some of the questions that are coming in through the chat?
Yes, thank you. We have several questions, so let me start with one from Ruby. So the question is, will the new federal monies from the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act be distributed via competitive grants only, or will there be direct distribution to state and local agencies via some other method of distribution? I think many of the audience know the formula and another type, but maybe for the big picture, could you elaborate on how the entire grant space works, and then how the money flows to Hawaii, and how people could go after them?
Does anybody want to take that one? maybe I can share a little bit based on my experience. So there tends to be formula funding that gets allocated, directly to typically, state jurisdictions, but also sometimes like local jurisdictions like cities and counties. And then they, will follow the procurement protocols and guidelines to then, pursue projects and essentially like hire and procure equipment supplies as they need to complete those projects. So that's one way. Competitive funding is also a big part of the funding that comes down the pipe from the federal government. And what I shared earlier in terms of the Climate Grants Accelerator and the funding opportunities that we have in that spreadsheet and over $30 billion, those are all competitive funding opportunities that typically either like a state agency, a county, city, or NGO, and sometimes even private sector are able to pursue. But there is, certain things that need to be met. There has to be an application. There has to be certain registrations that need to be met. So both of those are available. I think what's important is, if you don't know, reach out to government entities, as Leah had mentioned earlier. With their initiative, they've highlighted specific programs that are responsible for some of these funding sources that are going to be coming through them. As well, you can visit our Climate Grants Accelerator. You can sign up to grants.gov and also be able to see these opportunities. Really, there's many different ways of becoming aware of opportunities that are out there. Would anybody else on the panel like to comment on this question?
Thanks for taking that one, Veronica. Yeah, I mean, that you kind of nailed on the head. We're going to see all different types of streams of funding, and I think what we're really trying to do with the Grants Project Bridge is making sure that we're not leaving any funding on the table. So, if you come across, I will say there's some great resources. I know PICHTR has done some analyses on the bill funding, and I'm sure you folks will be doing the same for the IRA funding. Selecting the different types of projects that are available. The U.S. Climate Alliance has also done that, identifying, climate opportunities. That's something that we probably should be putting on our website pretty soon. So, that's a great way to find out what opportunities are out there and maybe the mechanisms. But, this is all brand new to a lot of the federal departments. So they're still trying to figure out how the funding is going to be coming through for a lot of these things.
Excellent. Thank you, Leah. Okay. I have a question that I want to ask all the panelists. But before I do, I have a question for the participants in this webinar. And I'm going to ask that you please enter your answer in the Q&A. Again, apologies that the chat has been disabled for whatever reason. So the question that I have for the folks in the audience is, what are the challenges that you encounter in addressing environmental justice, and what are the types of projects that where you have to address, or where you're looking to address environmental justice? So again, two-part question: what are the projects, and then second, what are the challenges that you are encountering in terms of addressing environmental justice? So I'm going to have audience members, if you can please submit your answers to those questions in the Q&A. Really appreciate it. And then what we're going to do is we are going to turn it over to our panelists to take a look at your answers and to comment on them. So in the meantime, I have a question for the panelists. And the question actually comes from Emily Gerke, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your last name correctly, Emily, but there's several tools that were discussed in today's sessions, panel presentations. Who are those tools available to?
Will I go ahead? Yeah, so there are lots of publicly available tools. So, the EPA has tools available. The Department of Energy has tools available. There's the EJ screening tool. There are definitely state-related tools where you can look at this data in terms of GIS maps. And, And then, you know, most states have their own sort of GIS maps of some of these resources. Some of the tools that I showed today, so for example, some of the social value tools that we have within Jacobs would be, you know, you'd work with Jacobs as a consultant to access those tools, but there are also publicly available information. So a couple of the tools that I shared, you can interface with on the internet and look at the data themselves. So yeah, so there's some of them are publicly available and some of them are proprietary tools. So combination, I guess.
All the tools we presented on are publicly available. The social vulnerability index that Suwon shared, you know, we're in the process of making it more user-friendly. Same with the Grants to Projects Bridge. You know, there's a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of information, kind of hard to navigate. Happy to share it with folks if interested. Absolutely develop these for access to all, but you know, I know they're not the most user-friendly currently.
And all the data we identified in the two, that's public data. So from different sources, including like the environmental justice, like tools mentioned by Donnie there. Yeah, and many other sources as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you all for that. So going back to the question that I asked the audience earlier, it was a twofold question, right? So what are your projects? And then what are your challenges related to those projects in addressing environmental justice? So let me read out what we've gotten from the audience. I'm going to ask Dorney, Leah, and Suwon to please, you know, comment on these reactions, okay? So from Phyllis, barrier is government not enabling this work. Emily, yep, that's correct. It was mostly a question for Dorney's Jacobs tools. Challenge, where do we find completed community benefits social value indicators? Anonymous attendee, challenge is a lack of local leadership and direct staff to direction to staff regarding prioritization of environmental justice related to lack of capacity. From Phyllis, new innovative methods for recycling water is one specialty. Another one is clean air in federal buildings and private workspaces. Challenge is knowing where the opportunities are. From GP Gay, I have been concerned about renewable energies for islands worldwide. Thanks to Hawaii for leading. And from Ruda, project materials recovery facility and curbside recycling. So any comments or reactions to that from the panelists?
I'm happy to start. I was just going to share that I think, you know, there are a number of challenges, and I think on the plus side, I think in terms of leadership and direction, you know, this issue is really getting the attention that it deserves now in this day and age, and I think that's great. But I do think that there still are challenges in terms of coordination and then standardization of the information that's being looked at. So I think it's probably not realistic to expect that we're going to get a sort of a one direction in terms of what tools to use and what tools to look at. But I think it's really great to note that that it is really important to try to figure out a way to look at community benefits, for example, in a standardized way and hold up that as a tool for measuring success in terms of environmental justice. So that's, I think I've touched on a couple of the challenges, but I'll let others add to that.
Thanks, Dorney. Yeah, I mean, I agree that we definitely have been seeing a lot more focus on climate and climate action, and especially with this new Inflation Reduction Act, you know, we're starting to see the funding come through to support, you know, the will to do it. So that's really exciting. I do understand, you know, like a lot of people have very specific questions and it's hard to get the answers to those very specific questions. And that's something that we're really grappling with and trying to find out, you know, what's the best way that we can connect people and that we can make sure that, you know, if you have a specific question, you can find the right people that are working on that, because, you know, there are people working on all of these things happening within the state, nationally, internationally. and what's the best way for us to connect people and make that information as available as possible to individuals and not just, those working in, the public sector. So, it's really a big challenge for us, something that we're hoping to address through expanding our website and making more of a kind of climate index type of thing where we can say, if you're interested in recycling, please go here and talk to these people. If you're interested in recycling water, these are the people that are working on it within the state. And, this is what we're familiar with happening in other places. Again, it's a capacity issue that, hopefully with additional funding and resources, we'll be able to address. But I feel you all, there's a lot of challenges out there that we really need to get onto. One more, just like specifically working on environmental justice. I think, it started off kind of like as this cool buzzword, then started to get incorporated into Justice 40. And, people are really taking it seriously now. And I think with the tools that Dorney presented on, as well as, what Suwon folks came up with, it's really going to be a lot easier to incorporate that into all of the actions that we're taking now. And so it really shouldn't be a separate issue, but it should be incorporated into everything we do. It's the same as like looking through things like an environmental lens, a climate lens, an environmental justice lens. And we are starting to develop the tools and have the capability of doing that now.
Yeah, I agree with Donnie and Nea. Just to add to that, like the value of leadership and also coordination cannot be stressed more enough. So I think one of the big challenges when we are developing the tools, when we are consolidating all these data sets, we do realize that they have a lot of different geospatial scale. Some of the data are available, let's say, at the census level. Some are at the parcels level, but not most of that, just a few, right? And then most of these probably be at the city level or state level. Then there's then let's say from different sectors, by different consideration of different type of hazards, when they are responding to us, their consideration probably be limited to their spatial scales of data they are considering and the type of hazards they are considering, right? Or the projects they are working on, the project scale as well. Then, but however, climate change is an issue that's like happen at different geographical scale. Everybody contributes to that. Everybody matters. Action matters. So let's say if we're doing something at the parcel level, we have to make sure that the projects we are doing at this level are consistent with the community level efforts, are consistent with the district level efforts, and also the city level, state level efforts. So to make that, I think one thing that the tools can function in future, but of course, this is only a starting point. We haven't been in that realm yet. But in future, if we do have an opportunity, let's say have a centralized visualization of all these indicators, and then also help different agencies, sectors provide some inputs about, oh, this is a project I'm working on, and this is the data I'm using, and at what scale, then we can say what are the potential conflicts and trade-offs or synergies between different projects and departments. And in that way, there can be better coordinations and at least understanding why the other departments are doing that thing, right? For example, energy department might be doing one thing, and then transportation department are thinking about their projects. There definitely needs to be talk and conversations between each two and more strategic plannings to coordinate all the projects.
Thank you all for those comments. I've had the privilege of working with entities, government entities, as well as non-government entities here in Hawaii, also, across the US. And I will say that environmental justice is complex. And in some ways, it's fairly nascent. I know Dorney has extensive experience, working on it, but I think for a lot of us, this is something that's fairly new and that we're starting to really grapple with and understand seriously. So I just want to, mention that and say that I'm very appreciative of the work that local entities, state entities in Hawaii and beyond are doing and embarking on this very complex topic, but also very important one. So thank you all for your work on that. I'd like to turn it over to Naoki because I've been looking at the Q&A. There's several really interesting questions that I think we ought to get into. So Naoki, can I turn it over to you?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so let me start with a question from Melissa, and then the question goes, what changes in support for these or other environmental justice projects, if any, might you envision given anticipated and potential changes in the upcoming elections? So for state level, Leah, and then for Congress, Dornis, so maybe start with Leah, please.
Thanks for that question, Melissa. You know, I don't know if I have the crystal ball to see it, but you know, it's by intention to make sure that we'll have additional support, and you know, that's going to be just hitting the ground running with whoever is going to be in our new administration, with making sure that they're you know, very cognizant of the importance of environmental justice and getting the funds into the state, first of all, but also, you know, just how much disparity we have within the state. You know, a lot of Indigenous people are, you know, impacted more severely, and especially as Hawaii, you know, we have a really important, you know, directive in order to make sure that we're taking care of the people within the state. So, you know, it's a central aspect to the work that the commission's doing. We're, you know, diving in head first, making sure that we're incorporating it into all of our actions and making sure that the tools are built out. Thank you, Suwan. Thank you so much for everything.
Sorry, I have to leave for another meeting, but sure, feel free to contact me. I put my my email address in the Q&A. Yeah, thank you. Great to see all of the panels. Yeah, I learned a lot in the webinar as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Suwan. Appreciate your time.
You know, and I'll just add, you know, we have seen, you know, huge shifts in what we're able to do, and you know, under the guise of different leadership, but we've always been able to find workarounds. The U.S. Climate Alliance is a huge example of that. You know, when in 2016 we were saying that we're going to remove ourselves from, you know, the Paris Agreement, we just stood up and said, no, that's absolutely not happening. And I think that's going to continue regardless of who's taking leadership.
So I'll just add a couple things to that. I mean, I think in terms of overall government, I think, you know, a really positive sign are things like what's happening with the Department of Energy. So the Department of Energy now has this strong focus on energy justice, and there's really strong leadership behind that. So I'd like to see a lot more of that. But I think one of the other things that I would aspirationally like to see, and I hope that this is how it goes, is that, you know, as more projects begin to be funded with these new emphases, I hope we'll see more about the measurement of success of those projects. And so then I think, you know, it will become clear, you know, how we make progress, the types of projects that we're funding that are actually chipping away at climate change, that are actually chipping away at these equity discrepancies in communities. You know, I'd love to see this, you know, sort of interim measure of progress allow us to shift priorities to those types of projects. So that's one of the things that I hope happens as we go.
Dorni, so that's really interesting to me. Measurements of success. You know, you've been in the environmental justice space for a while, and you presented tools that talk about how to, I guess, see where the issues lie in terms of addressing environmental justice. But let's say, you know, you put forth then a project gets funded. Can you talk about if and how you've been able to then take that to the next level and actually show progress in terms of environmental justice from a quantitative and even qualitative perspective?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the ways to do that is those, you know, sort of community benefit or social value measurement tools. So, you know, you can set a goal from the beginning, and then you can look at the percentage of the investment that actually went back into the community. And so, you know, I think that's a really important metric. I think also, over the longer term, it's possible to look at indicators like, improvement in public health, or even, increasing access to benefits. So, that's the whole idea behind DOE's energy justice measurement, is that as these clean energy projects become disseminated, how much of the low income community is able to tap into that, how much access has been created in those communities. So I think there's a few different thoughts out there about how to measure that long term, but it's a really great, I think it's a really great way to make a step forward in terms of environmental justice. This concept has been around for a long time, and the idea has always been to close the gap, but in some ways, I think we've just looked more closely at the gap at times, rather than actually taking measurable steps to close it, if that makes sense. So
it does. And we have a really interesting question from Bradley Romine. He wrote in the Q&A, we have urgent resilience and adaptation needs from sea level rise in our shorefront communities. Though I suspect the vast majority wouldn't qualify as disadvantaged communities by national standards. That's a question. So it's a bit of a big question. Leah and Dorney, can you comment on this? This is going to be the last question, unfortunately, then we have to wrap up.
Sure, yeah. And I don't have an answer to that, because we haven't had the ability to put all of our social vulnerability index into a mapping, which is, our next phase. We're looking for funding for it in order to map things out so that we can see. But I would guess, there's a lot of communities that would qualify. There's a lot of Department of Hawaiian Homelands that are there. And just because, oceanfront properties are maybe worth more doesn't mean that they're not also vulnerable. So short answer.
Yeah, I mean, great answer. And I think the only thing I would add to that is just, to encourage you to be creative. I think you can look around at different organizations, maybe within that community. Perhaps there's a nonprofit that represents, low income members of the population, or maybe there are some historic issues of relevance in that community. So really, to look creatively at the geography and the different groups that make it up, and perhaps that via that, you'll be able to tap into some of the federal funding.
Thank you all for your excellent comments. And Leah, Dorney, Suwon, who had to leave early, Naoki, and everybody in the audience. I need to wrap up. We are unfortunately out of time. I feel like we had a very rich discussion, and I'm just really thrilled for today's conversation. So what is next? We will be sending to everybody who registered for today's event the video recording and presentations, links to those. I also put in the chat, and I don't know if members of the audience can see it, but if you can, a survey. If you can please provide us your feedback. It's a 3-minute survey, and it just helps us do better and be able to address the topics that are interesting and valuable to you. So with that, I would again like to thank everyone, our panelists, Naoki, our DJ, PICHTR, the Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Commission, for bringing this webinar to you all today. And I just wish you a wonderful day. So thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.
Mahalo, everybody.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Thank you.